It began in the small town of Valershire, nestled deep in the woods of Maine, the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are buried just as quickly as they are whispered. But there was one secret, one story, that even the oldest locals were too afraid to tell, or perhaps they simply forgot. At least that's what they convinced themselves. Evelyn Whitmore was new to Valershire, a city girl looking for a fresh start after her divorce. She rented a small house at the edge of the woods, a stone's throw from the infamous Whitmore Estate, a decaying mansion that had stood empty for as long as anyone could remember. The estate had been in her family for generations, but now it was just a dark silhouette against the horizon, one of those places you don't go unless you had a death wish or an irrational sense of curiosity. Evelyn had no intention of staying long in the town, a few months, tops. But something about the isolation appealed to her, the quiet, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. She liked being alone. It gave her time to think, time to heal. But there was something off about Valershire. People were friendly but distant. Whenever she asked about the Whitmore Estate, they changed the subject. It wasn't that they were avoiding her, they were simply afraid. And that was the first sign that something was wrong. One evening, after a few weeks of settling in, Evelyn decided to take a walk through the woods. She wasn't afraid of them, despite the locals' warnings. It was late autumn, and the sky was painted in hues of purple and red. The air had a chill that made her wrap her coat tighter around herself. As she ventured deeper, the trees seemed to close in, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. That's when she heard it, a whisper, a voice carried on the wind, faint and distant, like it was coming from far away. At first, she thought it was just the sound of the branches creaking, but the voice grew clearer. "Come closer." She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. The voice was soft but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her imagination. Someone, or something, was calling her. She turned back to the path, but before she could take another step, the whisper came again. Come to the house." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The Whitmore Estate. She had heard the rumors. People in town said that the house had a way of pulling people in, making them forget the world outside. But she didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't believe in anything supernatural. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing her toward that decaying mansion. Against her better judgment, Evelyn found herself walking in the direction of the estate. The path was overgrown, barely visible beneath the thick carpet of fallen leaves. As she approached the house, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to stretch out their branches like skeletal hands, reaching for her. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark, like hollow eyes staring into her soul. The once grand structure now appeared desolate and forgotten, the paint peeling and the roof sagging. But there was still something alive about it, a pulse, a rhythm, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, her breath visible in the air. The door creaked open as though it had been expecting her. She hesitated for a moment, but then something inside her compelled her to step inside. The air was thick with dust, the floorboards groaning under her weight. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. The first room she entered was a grand parlor, its walls lined with faded portraits of people she didn't recognize. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as though the house itself was frozen in time. As Evelyn wandered through the rooms, she found that nothing had changed in decades. Furniture lay covered in white sheets, and cobwebs draped the corners like forgotten memories. But there was one room that stood out, a door at the far end of the hall, slightly ajar, with a dim light flickering inside. Without thinking, she moved toward it, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The light grew brighter as she approached, casting strange shadows on the walls. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was a small, windowless room, almost like a cellar. In the center, there was an old wooden chair, its legs worn from years of use, and sitting in the chair was a man. His back was to her, but she could tell he was hunched over, his head lowered as if in deep thought. "Hello," Evelyn called out, her voice trembling. The man slowly turned his head, and Evelyn gasped. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He looked like someone who had not eaten or slept for years. His lips were cracked and his skin was pale, but it was his eyes that unsettled her most. They were full of an emptiness that sent a chill crawling down her spine. "You shouldn't have come," he said in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. Evelyn took a step back. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly rose from the chair and shuffled toward her. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as though they were alive. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. "Leave," the man rasped. "Leave now, before it's too late." But Evelyn couldn't move. She was frozen, as though an invisible force had taken hold of her. The man was getting closer, and the darkness around them was deepening. The house, it was alive. It wanted her. She could feel it. The walls were closing in, and the door behind her had vanished. She was trapped. The man reached out a skeletal hand, his fingers brushing her arm, and in that instant, Evelyn saw it. The thing behind him. It was huge, monstrous, and shapeless. A mass of shadows and whispers. An entity that had been waiting for someone like her. Its voice echoed in her mind, low and guttural. "You're mine now." In that moment, everything went black. When the sheriff found her the next morning, she was outside the mansion, lying in the dirt, unconscious but alive. Her clothes were torn, her skin pale, and her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't speak for days, but when she finally did, she told the sheriff one thing over and over. "The house, it called me." And that was the last time anyone ever spoke of the Whitmore Estate. The locals didn't dare approach it, not after what had happened to Evelyn. The house, they said, was cursed. It wasn't just the mansion itself, but something darker, something older. The voices in the woods, the whispers that called to you, were just the beginning. And once you heard them, there was no escaping. Valershire had a new secret now, but it wasn't forgotten, not really. It was just waiting for the next person who would hear the call. And the house, it was still waiting for her.